This podcast is recorded on the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people.
British Columbia, I've seen your mountains high, seen your pretty rainbows and your blue crystal skies, watched your winding rivers as they flow around the bend. To me, you're not a stranger, you'll always be a friend. I've walked your snow-capped mountains.
Coming to you from the West Coast, this is Politicos. Today is March 18th, 2021, and this is episode 231.
I'm Scott Lundeboom.
And I'm Ian Bushfield. On today's show, David Eby picks a fight with Penticton, and MAID expansions become law. Thank you to the 100 people who contribute to the show every month. You can join them and support this podcast and keep us going at patreon.com/politicos. Politicos is in partnership with BC Today, British Columbia's daily newsletter dedicated exclusively to BC politics. Sign up for a free trial to have unique coverage of the BC legislature delivered to your inbox every morning. Listeners to Politicos enter the offer code CITIZEN for access to a special rate. For your free 2-week trial of the newsletter, go to politicstoday.news/free-trial. Before we jump into the show, how excited are you to get your vaccine by Canada Day?
I'm looking forward to it a lot.
The official announcement came out this afternoon at 1 p.m. that the province is ramping up vaccine distribution. They had been talking about this for a while, and they talked about the July 1st deadline for a couple weeks. But today they announced that the next wave of AstraZeneca vaccines will be targeting frontline workers over the next month and a half, 2 months. And that will include emergency first responders, teachers. So I'm very excited in this household, grocery store workers, as well as a number of other professions, childcare workers, basically anyone who has to go to work and has a high likelihood of interacting with the public. Good to see. Lots more vaccines going to be put out. I think the biggest challenge will be, can they ramp up the capacity they need?
Yeah, something to watch for sure. The one thing I don't get about this is, why are we changing up the prioritization again? Because if you remember, originally it was going to be, we're going to micro-target, or maybe micro-target's a little bit too strong, but basically break it down by professions, all of these other factors. And like a month or two ago, they reversed course on that. It basically went to a peer age-based system once they vaccinated frontline health workers. And now they're going back to a mixed system. And the thing I don't get is why it keeps changing.
I think the logistics dictated it a lot when the vaccines started coming and did require those centralized freezers. It meant giving vaccines to teachers in schools was probably harder than they intended. They did always say a month ago or so when they announced the age-based approach that extra vaccines could be targeted at other sectors, particularly frontline workers. So there was that footnote in there. I think we just all ignored it because we were all focused on the needles we have, not the ones we don't.
Yeah, but what exactly is an extra vaccine? Because a vaccine dose is more or less fungible with other vaccine doses. And yeah, there's some logistical challenges, but most British Columbians live in a place that is a decent sized urban area where you can have those dedicated facilities with dedicated cold storage units. And if anything, you'd think it would make more sense to break it down on geographic lines in terms of the logistics.
Whatever the reasoning in the Public Health Office, in the Ministry of Health, we're going to start seeing vaccines faster in a lot of different sectors. And hopefully it turns around the cases, because I think we saw over 600 today and that's been trending up. We're not calling it a third wave, even though Ontario is calling theirs a third wave. We're just concerned and optimistic. It's a weird situation to be in. But let's jump into our first main story. Mr. Eby goes to Penticton. The Attorney General has gotten in a fight with the Mayor of Penticton, British Columbia. I think we've now discovered why our province has intervened against Toronto and is supporting Doug Ford in that Supreme Court case we talked about a couple weeks ago.
Yeah, I think I argued at the time that it was good for the province to reserve the ability to act in the areas that are constitutionally their prerogative, and that's exactly what the Attorney General is doing here, because municipalities are creatures of the province, and as such, there are limits on what they can do, and the province ultimately is the responsible party for anything that goes on.
Yeah, so this story's been simmering for a couple weeks now, and we haven't touched on it because we weren't sure how big it was going, if it was just a war of words or what. But for the background, the Penticton City Council has now voted twice on March 2nd and March 16th to turn down an application by BC Housing to extend a permit on a temporary shelter that's at a former church in downtown Penticton. All right, it's not that small, but it's a smaller.
Even towns have downtowns.
Okay, the middle, the slightly denser area. The shelter was set up early in the pandemic as a way to provide some space so that people could be safe and not spreading COVID. That permit was permitted until March 31st. There are 42 people reportedly living there. And the province and BC Housing have been trying to extend that to March 2022 to give these people more security and more stable housing for that time, more at least supportive housing. The mayor of Penticton, and I guess unanimous council votes now twice, have said that it's not working out. They don't want this shelter to continue. They cite a lack of wraparound supports that's led to social disorder spilling into the surrounding community, and that this is increasing costs for police and fire services in the area. They're claiming that Penticton is carrying a disproportionate burden of supportive housing versus Kelowna or Vernon, who have fewer shelter beds than Penticton. And it escalated to the point where the mayor threatened to try to get council to deny future permits to BC Housing for developments even on land that doesn't require rezoning, which I'm sure would be a great judicial review of council's decision there. Meanwhile, the province has said that given Penticton's intransigence on this issue, they are not going to pay for the audits of the 3 existing supportive housing facilities that council wants. Instead, David Eby and the province are going to invoke statutory immunity to overrule them and just push ahead and allow this BC Housing project to continue.
So I think this is a good move on the government's part. If anything, I think they're being far too reluctant to intervene when it comes to localities making downright harmful housing policy decisions that are not just a local issue, but actually have ripple effects throughout BC. And this year and the previous similar issue that was in Maple Ridge back in the last term when then Minister of Housing and Municipal Affairs, Selena Robinson, overruled them as well. And it's good, but at the same time, 42 beds make a difference, but it's, as far as the general housing problems go, it's a relatively small portion of it, and you have a much bigger problem where pretty much every municipality in the province is simply far too restrictive when it comes to their housing policy. Even places that are much more progressive than Penticton, even here in Vancouver, it's effectively illegal to build social housing in most of the city. And the same thing goes to Victoria and other nominally progressive places. And the province really should be stepping in at that point, because by the time it gets to the point where people are homeless, a lot of else has gone wrong. And the big policy failures aren't local governments not approving shelters. It's the broader problems with local governments and the intersection on housing. And that has big effects in terms of the entire province's economy, prosperity, people's opportunity just broadly. So I'm good here, but if the government actually really wants to make a difference on housing, which market rate housing's hit like new highs recently, and the market's gotten ridiculously expensive and hot. It would be good if they were, I think, bolder on this front.
On the hot housing market, Minister Selena Robinson was asked about this recently, and she pointed to the lack of tools that can really quickly deal with the current situation where you're seeing absurd bidding wars and everything like that. And she mused that it would probably be a lot worse if they hadn't taken some of the demand side effects in the past, like the speculation and vacancy taxes and those kind of things. But then she went on to muse, and it was quite interesting, that the important longer term solutions, like you're talking about, are to increase supply. And she pointed at Vancouver's difficult development situation, something we're going to be talking about a lot on, and we do talk a lot about on Cambie Report. But she did not specifically say, I'm going to intervene. And it does come to one of those bigger political questions, one of those ones that's more than just this issue over 42 beds, or even the idea of having a provincial government that intervenes to promote the causes you want or we agree with at the municipal level. But it's one of those situations where once you let the genie out of that lamp, you can get a government that can go the other way. I know the provinces have pretty strong authority here, and they do exist in the Constitution. Municipalities don't. But I do worry about precedents where they could be abused the other way, where we have a current situation where Vancouver Council and Vancouver Police Board are in a battle over how much the cops should be funded, and the police board is appealing to the director of police services in the province to overrule city council. And who should be setting that budget under the approach we're talking about Eby taking here? It's the province. But I think a lot of people think at some point there needs to be more local accountability. And I'm sure this is a very live debate at the Police Act Reform Committee hearings that are happening right now.
Yeah, so on that, the way I'd think about it is, what is the operative level this stuff's actually working on and the effects are actually felt? In the police case, it is local, and there's a direct relationship between the city, which is the tax base that pays for the police, and whose the accountability for those tax rates ultimately rests with the city council. And that is different than this case when it comes to housing land use policy, which really does have very broad provincial effects. And as a result, we've been conditioned to think of housing as a local issue, but it really isn't. It's regional, it's provincial. Our economy does not grow as fast as it could. People from across BC don't have as many opportunities because where most of the jobs are here in Vancouver, it's just hard to move to. And if you're a kid graduating high school in Penticton, moving to where the jobs are here in Vancouver becomes much more challenging because of the restrictive policies that are here. So I get what you're getting at, but it's also the case that the effects and the accountability here are quite different between the two.
It does make the case for a broader reform to how zoning laws are made in the province, for example, than the one-off interventions that could be seen from a certain lens as spiteful personality battles between a mayor and a provincial politician. I'm sure that's how it will be seen by many, particularly, I'm sure, anti-NDP voters in the interior. And so there is that political angle to this of, is the better question, is the better approach legislative in the long term than just simply overruling the decisions you don't like? I think I answered my own question in asking it.
I think it is. And there are plenty of local councillors who would honestly be really happy if you took the very contentious, rezoning decisions out of their hands, so they didn't have to face a huge amount of heat over individual buildings and have to spend insane numbers of hours in public hearings for 35 units here or an apartment building there or such, or in many cases, social housing projects here and there and all of that. I think there'd actually be a lot of benefit, and they'd probably see it there. Now, for political reasons, they would be loath to admit that. So I think there is a much better equilibrium that can be found taking a lot of these decisions to a different level of government on that. Yeah, I think ultimately it does need to be legislative, because when you're doing one-off decisions where every now and then the minister decides this particular city council decision cross line, that is not very good, because it not only does it blur the lines of accountability, it does set the stage for contentious debates and back and forth. And yeah, the opposition parties will always take the opportunity to come to the defense of the places that are not, or come to the places that are fighting with the government. I think Eby himself spent a fair bit of time in the 2013 to 2017 period attacking the Liberals for their relationships with various municipalities. So it's just the theme that comes with the territory, and whether it's good or bad flips with whichever party is in power.
And just the politics of doing these one-off battles is not very good in the long run. Like, Eby can do well with the pro-housing crowd and with people who want to see more supportive housing with this type of approach or this specific approach. But he's going to piss off a lot of people in Penticton and in the South Okanagan. And it's not a strong area for the NDP. But
the Fraser Valley is the place I'd be thinking of. Because there was that Maple Ridge issue from the last term I was talking about. And that is the spot where the Liberals will be angling to pick up a bunch of seats that they lost this last election. So that is the spot where there does become political risk. Whereas a broad provincial municipal governance reform package would no doubt have its own contentions, but I think avoid some of those one-off issues.
So the NDP actually did win a few ridings in the southern interior, Vernon, Monashee, and Boundary Similkameen, most notably. Penticton still went BC Liberal, but there are, like you say, those Fraser Valley votes and a number of interior votes that built the NDP's strong majority this time that they won't want to lose in the long term. So finding the balance will be there. At least they have a few years to do it. Moving on to our second segment, access to MAID expands. The controversial Bill C7 was granted royal assent this week after a significant amount of debate in both chambers over a long period and multiple court extensions. It was actually now like a week ahead of its final due date. Unlike, I think, when Bill C14 was passed, it was within hours of the Supreme Court case being the new law. Bill C7 responds to a Quebec Supreme Court ruling several years ago now, where two individuals who, I believe it was two, whose deaths were not reasonably foreseeable, sought to have an assisted death. And they argued that the government's previous crack at passing an assisted death law was unconstitutional. And the Supreme Court ultimately agreed because
there's the Quebec Court, it's not the Supreme Court.
Quebec Court. And the Quebec Court ultimately agreed because when the Supreme Court decided Carter, it did not talk about a natural death being reasonably foreseeable. It didn't talk about terminal illness. The court simply said that anyone who has, quote, a grievous and irremediable medical condition that causes enduring and intolerable suffering should have the right to choose when and how they die by a medically assisted death. And it really framed it in terms of that personal, subjective view of those terms. There was no medical test. It's not the court's place to set out a medical test. And so this term reasonably foreseeable death became quite controversial in the initial law and was debated. And we've talked about this on the show before a few times because I've worked on it quite closely. This new C7 was largely supported by the pro-assisted dying community, though there were a number of like caveats and why did it do it this way kind of concerns. But overall, the government passing it was more supported than opposing it by groups like Dying with Dignity, largely because if this didn't pass, the Quebec Supreme Court ruling would apply in Quebec, but nowhere else in Canada. And we would, like we have for a number of other situations, I think particularly mandatory minimum cases, have multiple laws operating in this country at the same time because governments refuse to appeal things all the way to the Supreme Court or change the law when they're struck down in one jurisdiction.
Well, that's obviously not the case here, because they decided to actually change the law.
Yeah, so this creates a number of different situations for how you can access an assisted death in Canada. Essentially, there's a two-stream system that's based on whether or not you have a reasonably foreseeable death. That term is still not defined. I think the medical system is figuring it out, but it's still vague.
Neither of us are doctors. I think a doctor ought to be able to more or less interpret that in a fairly reasonable way. Vague, but it's not so vague that a medical professional wouldn't be able to, I think, parse it.
Yeah, there are clear cases on both sides. I don't think my natural death is reasonably foreseeable. If someone with a severe illness, it might be, depending on the illness and everything else. In any case, you have a now slightly easier way to access an assisted death if your death is reasonably foreseeable. Some of the waiting times have been eliminated. Some of the witness requirements have been reduced, so you don't have to have two independent witnesses from your doctor and your family. You can have it done a little bit easier. And then there is a significant number of safeguards, barriers, depending how you see them, for those whose natural death is not reasonably foreseeable. Things like a 90-day waiting period and a number of other signature requirements and witness requirements. This came under criticism largely and a lot in the last. It was always criticized by many in the disability community, but I noticed a lot of volume in the last 6 months in particular over this, arguing that this latter category, this natural death is not reasonably foreseeable, is primarily only people with disabilities. And therefore, this is, or to put it in the harshest critique that was out there, a form of eugenics against people with disabilities, particularly those from marginalized groups. And
that really seems a stretch to go that far.
It's at very least a way to further diminish their value as humans, because there would be, and I can believe this, pressure from insensitive parts of our medical community to push people who aren't viewed as worthwhile by many towards an assisted death when they could otherwise go on. And it was pointed out it's been pointed out importantly that the assistance rates we provide for people with disabilities are nowhere near what they need to be to live, particularly in cities like Vancouver and Toronto. And so there was a lot of concern about why are we pushing forward this bill, not lifting up people? Why are we making it easier for people with disabilities to die, but not to live? Simply put. And for me, I always understood that argument and I sympathize with it a lot. I've worked with groups with people with disabilities. I have family members with severe disabilities, but it's still like a separate issue, an important one, but like a distinct one. It's one of those, not passing this bill if this bill died, there would not have been suddenly the compassion and support for people with disabilities that we want. Like killing this bill won't end ableism in Canada.
Yeah, I think that's, both true and also I think indicative of a way sometimes political discussions can go a little off the rails sometimes for just that reason. Like, if you wait till every other policy area is in perfect or just really good alignment, not much will ever actually get done. You got to take every small little incremental step, and especially when they are, in fact, different policy areas, even if there's some overlap on that.
And it's forgotten in all of these debates, or in many of these debates, that the people leading the push for this change and for these expansions have almost all been individual people with disabilities, whether it's Kay Carter, who fought the Supreme Court case, or Julia Lamb, who was leading a challenge here in BC before she died, or I believe even the people in Quebec who fought that challenge. These are individuals with disabilities who were fighting for their rights and their dignity. And I get frustrated by this argument that we need to uphold the dignity of people with disabilities, but then we can't grant them the dignity to make this choice freely. And I get that the argument is many aren't able to make it freely, but so many things wrong with our society. Let's not impede one here or there. The other thing that was really interesting about this whole debate, and it happened with C14 as well, is it's a real lesson in how our parliament works and how bills become law. This bill, especially when you have a very independent Senate. So part of what took this bill so long to pass was the initial version was passed by the House. It went to the Senate. It was thoroughly reviewed. It was debated. And then it was amended in, I think, 5 key ways, and I don't have those in front of me. And that was sent back to the House. And the House of Commons then had the government present its response to the Senate, which was, we're going to accept some of your amendments, we're going to change some, and we're going to just reject other amendments. And they asked the House to pass that. And the House eventually did. The Liberals had to invoke closure as the Conservatives did their best to filibuster it. And finally, the Bloc, I believe, voted on side with the Liberals. The NDP actually voted against it for differing reasons, depending on which story you read. Some said the NDP was wanting to have more debate on it to hear the people with disabilities concerns. Another said Jagmeet Singh was upset that the Senate is an unelected chamber and shouldn't be amending bills, so they voted against it on that principle, which was dumb.
Sounds like just a good way not to have things go ahead.
It's a good way to not take a position on an issue. Finally, the response was passed by the House, and it went back to the Senate again for the second time, because the same bill has to be passed by both chambers, and the Senate approved that with mostly just the Conservative senators voting against it. I think there were 25 votes in total against the bill passing. And it was, I think it's becoming a bit of a trend where the independent senators are taking the view that they will try once to change a bill, but if it comes back to them, they'll defer to the House of Commons as you're the elected ones. We're just here to make sure you consider that other thing approach.
I think it's been more pronounced, but this has more or less had that, I think, as an unwritten rule for a while. I think they're just using it more often, but I can't think of any examples where the Senate has sent something back twice or 3 times.
For so long, the Senate was partisan and was typically the same partisan makeup as the House of Commons. There would tend to be enough turnover in the Senate that whoever was the newly elected majority prime minister could just stuff the House or stuff the Senate and get their way, and there would be far less debate. And I think we're getting far more debate in the Senate and far more amendments coming forward than ever. That's also log jamming the parliamentary calendar quite a bit, but maybe some of our laws are coming out better for it. To be determined.
That's definitely to be determined. We're going to talk in a moment or two about one that got struck down, so it's clearly there's still room for improvement on that.
So what the Senate ultimately did get through in the amendments is, with this newly amended and newly law changes to our assisted dying law, one of the biggest criticisms advocates for assisted dying had with Bill C7 is that the initial bill fully precluded people with mental illnesses from accessing assisted dying. And as you'll recall, the standard I set out I mentioned was in Carter, did not talk about physical versus mental illness. And so there's this question of, should someone who is suffering from purely a mental illness be able to access this? The House and government agreed to have a 2-year clause where we will study this issue much more thoroughly in this time. And after that, we'll try to make sure there is some provision and some safeguards so that people who are suffering from mental illnesses do have that option. And the other is that there's going to be a parliamentary committee, a joint parliamentary committee, Senate and House, to review some of the other outstanding issues, such as advance requests for those who are fearing losing mental competence, for example, people who are in the declines of dementia, who want to say, when I reach certain point, pull the plug, and other access issues, such as for mature minors who generally have the same medical rights in Canada as adults. So a lot more. This debate isn't over. I think we've moved a lot closer to the Carter Standard, which took a long time and a lot of debate and fighting to get to there. And hey, even the Spanish Parliament voted this past week to pass an assisted dying bill, which is fun to note because I don't tend to think of Spain as... Actually, I don't know what I think of the culture of Spain. I know they have a long Catholic influence that could potentially work against these kind of policies moving forward, but it was interesting.
They definitely laid behind like Northern Europe on a lot of these questions. But yeah, it's not going to be the last we'll talk about this for sure. Like that, no doubt the mental illness part is going to be significantly controversial going forward, and for good reason. Like it does become a significantly trickier question when the underlying medical condition prompting this does pose the potential to interfere with the ability to give the requisite consent. I think it's probably good they're taking their time on this one. Moving on to quick takes, as briefly hinted at in the last segment, one of the Liberals' laws was struck down this week as the Ontario Superior Court of Justice has struck down previously made changes to the Canada Elections Act, specifically around the provision in Section 91 about not making false statements. This has, I think, been an item of particular interest in the last half decade or so, as social media, fake news, and election interference has become a bigger and bigger issue, both here and abroad.
Yeah, this is definitely one of those areas that touches on all the civil libertarian strands inside of me, where I really hate politicians who run around lying and generally acting in bad faith and making our democracy worse. But legislating against it also leaves me feeling really uncomfortable and distrustful about how that will be applied.
Well, in this case, it wasn't even so much the question about people acting in bad faith, but more, what about people who aren't? Specifically, the decision hinged on the changes that were made in the 2018 Act, where the rule that no person should make a false statement regarding a various list of items had the word knowingly removed from it. So before it was no one would knowingly make a false statement, and now it's just no one can make a false statement, which if you've ever been on social media, how much crap and just misinformation that is just floating out there becomes a real problem that even the best intentioned people can't always effectively sort that out. So taking away the word knowingly in that presents real problems for people who were sharing what they thought was the truth. And that was ultimately why the court struck down their provision.
Yeah, this list of things you couldn't lie about include place of birth, professional qualifications, membership in a group. There's a lot of things that I might presume about politicians, and I may even say on Twitter, like not even positive or negative, just, hey, I thought so, and people might think Stephen Harper was born in Calgary because that would seem to fit, but the man comes from Toronto. Would that have been a crime to say?
I think in the plain language, yeah, it would have been.
I guess you did have to have the intention of affecting the results, but it gets murky, and I think not having the word knowingly in there makes it just unwieldy and a bad law.
Yeah, I guess in this case, the Senate's second thought isn't quite enough in this case. The government had asked for the decision's effects to be stayed for 12 months, but the judge ultimately declined that, and instead, the ruling is going to take effect immediately.
That is, unless the government appeals it and asks for an injunction on this taking effect. I think that timeline is really important to pause on. With the amount of speculation about a snap election being called as early as a couple months from now, maybe even this fall, it's likely will be an election within 12 months. So whether that law stands or not is a very live question.
Yeah, so the government can ultimately appeal or decide to write a new law. Now, the rate this government actually gets anything through Parliament, particularly when there's anything controversial to it, which Election Act changes likely will be, that gets even slower. So that might not actually be a feasible path if they're planning on calling elections soon. So maybe we'll see them appeal it. But yeah, in the meantime, there's still all the usual rules about fraud and other fraud, libel, slander. All those rules still apply even in elections.
If we go to an election, one party that will be looking to grow their number of seats is the Conservative Party. We talked a lot last week. We dedicated the main part of our show to talking about the challenges facing the Conservative Party, and they're going into their convention as we speak. I think earlier today the pre-convention started. But very interestingly, David Coletto of Abacus Data has a poll out and some analysis on how can Canada's Conservative Party grow support. And he has 5 recommendations, hints from his poll that range from needing to appeal to younger and more diverse Canadians, to dropping anti-immigrant sentiments, accepting that climate change is real, and maybe laying off the Trudeau hate, since potential Conservatives don't hate Trudeau as much as conservatives do.
Yeah, the convention actually is underway right now. It did kick off Thursday afternoon, so it's both in progress as we're recording this and when you'll be hearing it. I presume you actually listen to it within a day or so, the podcast coming out. But in terms of what they've actually found, in some ways it's good to have data on this. In some ways it is entirely unsurprising. Like I bet if you took a similar set of polling around the NDP, you would find that potential NDP voters are a lot less ideological and more towards the Canadian mainstream than NDP partisans. So in that sense, it's almost a bit of a water sweat poll, but nevertheless, there's actually some quite useful bits of information in here. I think the Trudeau hate in particular, Conservatives should really learn to, or really ought to take to heart, because they're just passionate hatred of the guy just does not translate outside of people who aren't already voting for them already, and just makes it's weird too. Like, it's not like some of the other stuff like climate change or whatever. You can actually understand there's different policy priorities. It's weird and personal and has no resonance outside of them.
One of the things Coletto points out in this piece is by leaning into things like the Trudeau hate or these traditional conservative votes, is what happened in 2019 is they run the table in strong conservative ridings in Alberta and Saskatchewan and fail to break through in suburban ridings and in Vancouver and Toronto, where they need to get votes to win. So you can end up with the situation again where the Conservatives get the popular vote, but lose the important vote, as it were, the number of seats.
Yeah, they just need one more vote than the next highest candidate in a whole bunch of prairie ridings where they are right now winning by massive margins. They can afford to lose a few votes there if it makes up for it in the GTA, Metro Vancouver, parts of Quebec. There's a lot of potential room to grow, but that does also mean growing, and that does mean meeting Canadians where they are. And this is, I think, we talked about this a lot last week, but it really has been a consistent problem of the party ever since, I guess, really 2011, which I think was the last time the Conservative Party actually made a really good pitch that was squarely aimed at just the broader Canadian public, rather than very, I guess, stalwart party-based voters.
And the numbers in here are quite stark. Like the climate change one is quite something. So the whole poll is divided into Conservative supporters, are people who said they have voted Conservative, and potential Conservatives, that is people who would be open to voting Conservative, but maybe haven't voted that way recently or won't vote that way next time unless things change. And so among the Conservative supporters, the voters, only 1 in 3 told the pollster that they think climate change is a crisis, versus those potential supporters, it was over half. And notably, 18% of Conservative voters thinks climate change is a hoax.
Compared to just 4% of potential.
More than 4 times. I don't know what.
Conservative potential voters?
Okay.
Yeah, it's 4% is the number on there.
Okay.
So yeah, there are just some pretty big gaps on that one. And yeah, there's a huge potential, I think, to moderate on climate change. And it's weird that the carbon tax is taking on this valence that is more of a political shibboleth than any actual policy aspects to it, and whether or not it agrees with the first principles you would expect a Conservative Party to use when defining their policy program, which is really too bad, because if they could just have a leader that could bring them around on this issue, there's huge potential upsides for them on this. And they're just not doing it. And unfortunately, I think O'Toole's at the moment in a position where he's facing enough internal pressures that it's unlikely he's going to be able to make that pivot. But hopefully he'll surprise us.
The Boys in Short Pants had a good segment in their latest episode on this challenge, and why do Conservatives and the party seem to continually take on more and more partisan ideological positions. And they point the blame more than anything at the political fundraising system we're stuck on, where you have to chase those small dollars and you have to generate outrage in the short term to get the money. And we talked about this a bit last week too, I think in the BC provincial situation, or a couple of weeks ago.
It's a thing I fairly frequently bring up. So there's probably a lot of past podcasts where we've talked about it.
And it's funny because the reason we're in this situation is because Stephen Harper nuked the per vote subsidy. And maybe if he hadn't done that, his party wouldn't have become so ideological. Many would argue, and I probably would at times, that Harper was quite ideological, but even more so these days. And it's almost a just bit of Canadiana politics that it was Chrétien's changes that nuked the federal Liberals for a generation, and maybe Harper's changes killed the Conservatives for a generation.
So what you're telling me is the lesson here is don't change the fundraising rules?
No, I think the Chrétien ones were definitely for the better, but doing so, your party better be smarter than the rules you're changing. They can have unintended consequences, though.
One thing I don't think we actually mentioned at the top of this is that the headline number is 46% of Canadians would consider voting Conservative, which I think you have to go back to Mulrooney to find an election that's anywhere near that. There is firmly room to strike out for a majority territory on this one, and that is just something I think the Conservatives actually need to seriously consider how they actually reform themselves to the point where they could reach that level. Now, you're never going to get an election where all 46% is going to break for one party. But still, there's a lot of room to grow on that. But that does mean they actually have to change a few of the policies that are driving people away.
Unfortunately, the bulk of this poll doesn't come out till tomorrow, so go look it up on abacusdata.ca. We're just referencing his blog post analysis right now, but that will tell you what percent of Canadians would consider voting Liberal, NDP, and Green in different proportions. I guess the other final one bit that I'll pull out is one of the really surprising things is the Conservatives are in fourth place in people under 30 behind the Greens.
Yeah,
so that's where you need to get some young people in your party.
Yeah,
they say
really do.
Go ahead.
Like, it should not be that hard to do. There's the general perception out there that young people are more liberal, less conservative, but there is a solid 30-ish%, I would say, that are reasonably conservative, and you're not actually being able to reach out to them. You're failing in some pretty bad ways, and there's, I think, been a lot of interesting discussions going on among kind of the under 40 conservatives out there about the directions Canadian conservatism needs to go. But it really does. But that is also reasonably different than what the Conservative Party has been until now. And I think over the next decade or so, you're going to see quite a generational change happening in conservative politics that we're just starting to see the first indications of in blogs and podcasts and Substacks right now, and probably the odd policy convention. But I do think the Conservative Party has, or if the Conservative Party can do what it needs to do, it's going to look a lot different in 5 to 10 years.
Maybe O'Toole just needs to get on TikTok. And to close today's show off, I wanted to mention and recognize the passing of Ian Waddell, a longtime figure in BC politics, a former BC cabinet minister, longtime member of parliament, someone who had praise and accolades from across the political spectrum for the amount of work he did. I met Mr. Waddell 3 or 4 years ago when he was going around showing off his memoirs. He spoke for us at the BC Humanist Association. I'll drop a link to the podcast of that talk he did for us. But just briefly, Waddell was Member of Parliament for Vancouver Kingsway and I think later Port Moody from 1979 to 1993. Most famously, he was pretty much instrumental in drafting Section 35 of the Constitution Act that recognized Indigenous and treaty rights in Canada and got the language in there that made sure those rights are protected in ways that, is still resonating today. He ran for leader of the federal NDP to succeed Ed Broadbent in 1989. He lost in 1996, he lost his seat in 1993 and moved to provincial politics, where he was the Minister of Small Business and Tourism from 1998 to 2000 and helped lead the 2010 Winter Olympic bid. And then he was Minister of Environment briefly before the NDP was burnt to the ground. He tried to stage a comeback. In 2004 in Vancouver Kingsway. He lost that year and in 2006 to David Emerson, the MP famous for crossing the floor to join Stephen Harper's cabinet like the day of the election. He then retired from politics in 2008 because there's no way a Conservative was winning in Vancouver Kingsway.
No, although I think Emerson made it like a full 24 hours or so before crossing the floor. It's like the day after
the discussions were before election night, though. It was quite something. Did you ever come across Waddell's work?
I mean, I'm familiar with kind of some of the key points in it. I only briefly met him once. I was actually in the audience of the debate we hosted for the proportional representation referendum and got a chance to briefly meet him after that. Yeah, seems all around nice guy and will be missed. And that has been Playtoast. Find links to everything we talked about at playtoast.ca. Support the show and get access to our Slack channel at patreon.com/playtoast. Our intro music credit is Beautiful British Columbia by Serge Plotnikoff. Playtoast is a production of Lightning Boot Media, and editing services are provided by CHLY 101.7 FM in Nanaimo. Wash your hands and stay home. Thanks for listening.